With the end of the Operation Unthinkable series, we have seen a scenario that, if executed, would have changed the world forever. With the surrender of a major portion of the Red Army in Europe and with nothing to stop the Western Allies, the Soviet Union is forced to accept an unconditional surrender. Before we get to what happens next, let's do a quick review of what happened during this series. In 1945, Winston Churchill asked his general staff to come up with a plan for a square deal for Poland, if Joseph Stalin went back on his promise of allowing Poland free and independent elections. Seeing that Stalin would not keep his word, the West propaganda machine went into full swing, focusing on Soviet atrocities and in some cases fabricating new and harsher atrocities. While this was going on, the British began to secretly train 100,000 German POWs who were willing to fight with the West to kick the Soviet Union out of Germany. On June 12, 1945, the Germans were let loose on Soviet forces. The Soviet Union had no indication of an attack of this magnitude, and the Red Army was caught completely off guard. The Germans were able to make some progress in their sector. They were able to hit supply depots, break communication lines, and cause a lot of chaos, which was exactly what Churchill and the West had wanted. The Soviets were now beginning to contain the Germans, but on June 23rd, a British patrol found itself under fire from Soviet forces. After nearly being wiped out, 2 British soldiers were able to get to an American checkpoint and inform them of the attack. The Americans quickly passed the information to command. Now that the Soviets had engaged Western forces, the Western Allies declared war on the Soviet Union on June 24, 1945. American armor made the first push into Soviet lines, inflicting heavy casualties along the front and even taking some serious ground. This was due in no small part to the air superiority which the West enjoyed. With the addition of the remnants of the Luftwaffe, the West was able to hit Soviet positions behind their lines. The Soviets, on the other hand, did enjoy a numerical superiority on the battlefield, which in some cases equated to a 4-1 advantage. Despite the losses, the Soviets were able to dig into positions and hold their lines, and in some cases were able to start pushing the Western Allies back, erasing the gains that they had made. With the loss in momentum on the front, the West attempts to put together a grand offensive to break the Soviet lines. As troops are again amassed and thrown at the Soviets, they find themselves making no gains due to the stiff Soviet defense. Truman and Churchill find themselves in a situation that truly concerns them. They know that it is possible that the Soviets could keep pushing the West back, potentially even kicking the British and Americans out of the European continent. Therefore, on August 10, 1945, orders were given to drop the first atomic bomb on Moscow. That blast killed Joseph Stalin and a number of other high-ranking officials, including some in the Politburo. 2 days later, another atomic bomb hit Leningrad, killing many more. The Soviet Union was reeling from these losses, and their command structure was shattered. Marshal Zhukov took command of the armed forces to maintain their ability to fight, while the next head of the Soviet Union was being decided. On the 18th of August, paratroopers are dropped behind the Soviet lines to help with the offensive. These paratroopers destroy bridges, attack supply lines, and any targets of opportunities that presented itself. While effective in their task, the paratroopers were not a sufficient force to fully contain the Red Army. The Soviets countered with guerrilla tactics of their own to force an escape route open and to keep the paratroopers and the main Western force at bay. If the Soviet Union were to lose Berlin, it would drop morale even lower than it has ever been before. Despite the bitter fighting, the Germans, however, are able to retake Berlin. With most of Germany now secured by the West, the German forces who helped in the initial push were being replaced on the front by the French army, who had been held in reserve. Part of the reason why they were being replaced was because most in the West didn't feel that the Polish would take too kindly to German soldiers once again being on their territory. The Soviets were really beginning to worry about the ever-increasing speed of the Western advance. With air superiority on this side of the West, some experts were saying that soon the USSR would have to face an opponent who had air supremacy. Kiev had just recently suffered a nuclear blast, and the Soviet Union was looking for any advantage that they could get. A deal was struck with Japan and the Soviet Union to stand up to their common foes. While not technically an alliance, the Red Army felt comfortable enough to pull their forces off of the Eastern Front. These forces were put into action in the Middle East, hoping to hold the oil fields of Iran to use as a bargaining chip in any peace negotiations that may take place in the future. The UK tried to get their troops from their colonies in India, Pakistan, and Australia into the fight as quickly as possible. The Australians took the brunt of the Soviet push and put up a staunch defense despite being heavily outnumbered. Again, nuclear weapons played a factor as Tashkent was leveled by a nuclear blast, preventing more supplies and reinforcements from helping the Soviets in Iran. Remember, Poland was the reason why Churchill called for Unthinkable, and now the war was at its height in Poland. Fearing that Warsaw was going to be the target of a nuclear blast, and due to the atrocities of the Red Army in retribution on civilians, the people of Warsaw rose up yet again, this time across the entire city with the hopes of casting out the Soviets before the Allies arrived. The Soviets spared no time in shelling the city, though, in retaliation for their uprising. Conscripting as many Poles as they could, the Soviets tried to throw them at the Allies, and in some cases pitted Polish forces tied to the west against Polish forces of the Red Army. This effort by the Soviets was based on the hope that the Polish loyal to them would resist the West at all costs. It proved to be fruitless. With the Soviets in retreat, the West attempted to surround a large portion of the Red Army with forces of the Third Army. In a final attempt by the Soviets to stop the encirclement, they threw the last combat-ready forces at the Third Army and General Patton. Their hopes were dashed when these forces were absolutely crushed by a better supplied and more mobile force with air support to back them up. Now fully encircled and unable to break through, Soviet leaders began to flee to the only safe haven available to them in Japan. Japan had problems of their own. During Operation Unthinkable, they had been starved of resources by a blockade of the US Navy. This blockade had starved the civilians of even the most basic of supplies and had actually caused a lot of people to die from hunger. In addition to this, they also had to suffer repeated fire bombings all across the country. They too were about to surrender after suffering 2 nuclear strikes in Hiroshima and Kokura. They also knew that they would have to face the full brunt of the Allies alone if the Soviet Union surrendered. On October 12, 1945, both the Soviet Union and Japan surrendered to the Western Allies, bringing what many believed to be a new era of peace under an Anglo-American world order. As part of the terms of the surrender, Poland was liberated and the Soviet Union was dissolved, with each republic becoming its own democratic nation. The economies of these countries were terrible for decades to come, as they not only had to transition from a socialist to capitalist economy, but they had major population centers that were completely destroyed by nuclear attacks. These countries were also forced to pay reparations to the Western Allies, Poland, and to Germany. In Germany, denazification and the Nuremberg trials did take place like in our timeline. Their constitution as a democratic nation prohibited the raising of any military force except under the direction of the United States, Great Britain, and France. Germany did agree to pay reparations to the Allies, but with money flowing in from the former Soviet states, such reparations proved to be negligible. Over time, Germany recovered and became an economic and cultural center of the European continent. Japan, however, suffered the worst of all. The emperor was allowed to stay in power and the US occupied the islands, but without the need to have a power in Asia to counter communist aggression, reconstruction was very limited. In many ways, Japan became an American colony that was exploited at every turn. The economy lay in tatters and few wanted to help the country that attacked the United States at Pearl Harbor. With no Soviet Union, one could argue that the world would be a better place. No Cold War, no communist China, no Korean or Vietnam wars. But would it really? With 2.5 million more people dead because of Operation Unthinkable, and with the normalization of the use of nuclear weapons complete, the world would be changed forever. The US had the world in fear from that time on. The fear was that if anyone stepped out of line from what the US had wanted, they would suffer a nuclear attack. This didn't bode well for US perception in the world. What really worsened the standing of the US in the worldview was when they rushed to develop more and larger nuclear weapons to keep the advantage in their favor, and nuclear proliferation became the top national security policy. As we saw in this scenario, nukes made the difference. There was no way the USSR could hope to win against a nuclear-ready US, and neither could anybody else unless they too had nuclear weapons. Regional wars would persist across the globe due to the power vacuum caused by the loss of the Soviet Union. Nations of the British Empire who wanted their independence rose up, and most of these movements were crushed violently. The British too sought nuclear weapons as a way to maintain their status and eventually obtained them, causing a souring of relations between them and the United States. From here, anything could have happened, and that's up to you to imagine what would have happened next if Operation Unthinkable would have happened. My next episode is going to be a retrospective of this series from my point of view, talking about things that I did well, things that I could have improved on, what I liked and didn't like, and it also is going to give you all a chance to take a survey about how I did, so that way I can get feedback from you. That's definitely important. Don't forget, we're going to be having a multiplayer Operation Unthinkable mission, which more information about that will be coming soon. So definitely keep watching for that. After that multiplayer mission is complete, I'll announce and start the next alternate history series. So I hope you guys will stick around for that. I'm excited for it, and I hope you will be too. Like the video if you enjoyed what you saw. Subscribe for more of this type of content because we are continuing, obviously, with alternate history series. If you can donate to the Patreon to help out and support what I'm doing here, that goes such a long way. And also, please join our Discord. There's information there about operations we do together, like what you'll find with Operation Unthinkable. And we have a number of great discussions. Hope to have you there. Thanks again for watching, you guys. I appreciate it. Rest well and dream of large women.